Can herbs boost BDNF, and what on earth is BDNF? Let's begin by looking at a very interesting observation. It was published recently, 2 case histories of 2 patients who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or similar, who didn't deteriorate. The first was a patient at age 64. He was diagnosed firstly with mild cognitive impairment, and more than 15 years later, at age 80, he had minimal cognitive and functional decline from the age of 64, even though he was then diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's disease. And then there was a second patient who was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment at age 72, and most likely it was dementia-based. And at age 80, he showed no clinical progression. So they didn't worsen over time, which is the characteristic thing that you see. Why? Well, one of the possible contributors was intense physical activity as the likely disease-modifying factor. Both patients regularly exercised vigorously for hours a day and increased their participation in exercise even further after they either retired or reduced their work hours. So what does exercise do? No doubt it has many benefits, but one of the key benefits that exercise has for the brain is that it boosts BDNF. So this specialized protein named Brain Derived Neurotropic Factor, or BDNF, promotes neuroplasticity, and that's the ability of the brain to form new connections and pathways. Animal studies have shown that increasing the availability of BDNF to the brain encourages the formation and storage of memories, enhances learning, and overall boosts cognitive performance and boosts the survival of neurons. And for these key roles, BDNF is attracting a lot of interest in terms of something that could delay the onset of brain aging, and especially Alzheimer's disease. So you can see this article is suggesting that just 6 minutes of high-intensity exercise a day could delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease, because that high-intensity exercise especially boosts BDNF. Now, we should all be exercising, but are there herbs that can boost BDNF? So I picked up this interesting infographic online that says BDNF improves all form of plasticity in the brain and helps your brain adapt and learn, and exercise, good sleep, healthy diet, and reducing your stress are all factors that will help keep your BDNF at optimal levels. But can herbs play a role here? Well, yes, I believe they can. And I would suggest there are 4 key herbs that can help in this regard. And they are, well, curcumin, it's a phytonutrient, but it comes from turmeric, as we know. The Chinese herb buplurum, ginkgo biloba doesn't have such a wonderful range of activities, and hypericum, or St. John's wort, which you can see pictured. But first, a word of warning. You'll see things like this online, 140 plus natural ways to increase BDNF. And in such things, you'll see extrapolations of test tube research. So there's probably about 70 or 80 different herbs that have been shown to boost BDNF in test tube studies. But especially with the brain, given that it's kind of locked away behind the blood-brain barrier, though that research doesn't have a lot of relevance clinically. So the 4 herbs, as I'll show you, that I've just mentioned in the previous slide, have all been clinically shown to boost BDNF. So be wary of long lists and excessive extrapolation from in vitro research. And this was highlighted in a recent review. It gives on the top the number of studies for which a particular herb has been studied in the context of boosting BDNF. And then down the left side, you can see all the different herbs. Well, if you went on that, ginseng, Panax ginseng, Chinese or Korean ginseng would be your number one choice. But guess what? All of those studies are either test tube or mouse and rat studies, and they don't necessarily have any clinical relevance. So don't go on the number of studies if they're all test tube and animal models. I do not use ginseng to boost BDNF for that very reason. I use the 4 I've just mentioned because they have clinical data. And you see there's relatively few studies on Hypericum perforatum, so John's wort down there at the bottom, but it does have a human clinical trial. So that trumps all of the rats and mice and all of the test tube research. So let's firstly look at curcumin, because there's quite robust evidence from several clinical trials that show sometimes dramatic improvements in BDNF. Now, I must mention a little bit of a caution here. So BDNF is going to help your brain if it's produced and acting in your brain. But in these human clinical trials, you can hardly, drill a hole in someone's cranium, extract out and say, oh, yes, there's more BDNF. So what are they measuring here? They're measuring circulating BDNF, serum or plasma BDNF. But it's a fairly good de facto measure for what's going on in the brain. So it does have that element of relevance, but we're not measuring the levels in the brain. So that gives us just a little pause for caution, although generally scientists agree if it's produced at high levels in your circulating blood, in your serum, it probably does reflect the brain. So back to curcumin, and you can see if you look at the intervention, the numbers for BDNF in the left side, they're very dramatic increases. In a couple of the trials in the control group, BDNF went down substantially. So big differences for curcumin. And aren't we so lucky that we can give just one phytochemical, preferably in bioavailable form, and get such a range of benefits, including this impact on BDNF. Another dramatic increase in BDNF was seen in this clinical trial on the Chinese herb bupleurum. Now, it was a trial in patients with chronic kidney disease, so not necessarily, a normal cohort, but I believe that this herb does have relevance also for healthy people wanting to stay healthy. Another point, and you'll notice that from the title of the paper, Radix bupleurii ameliorates depression by increasing nerve growth factor and BDNF, is that low BDNF is thought to be a factor in depression. And that's kind of highlighted when I talk soon about St. John's wort. But you can see that the increase, if you look at the graph A, the increase in nerve growth factor, which is another brain trophic factor that's important as well, was almost doubled by the bupleurum. But you can see that there. So the light grey is the bupleurum, the dark grey is the control group. But if you look at BDNF, it was extraordinary, the increase in it. That looks like it's about tripled the BDNF from the bupleurum. And it was just 1 gram a day, so not a huge dose. Now, I mentioned St. John's wort, and there was this one study. It was open label, but it did reveal some interesting findings. And it was if you like, testing the hypothesis, well, do antidepressants, not necessarily act by serotonin impact, but could it be about BDNF for at least some of them? But if you look at the effect of the antidepressants, TCAs is tricyclics, SNRIs, they're fairly modest, and one group of drugs over the right actually lowered BDNF compared to baseline. The SSRIs did have a significant effect, but you could see the effect of the SSRIs on BDNF was dwarfed by St. John's wort. So it could well be that perhaps one of the main mechanisms of St. John's wort is that it helps depression by boosting BDNF, that its impact on serotonin mechanisms is probably minimal, and hence its interaction with SSRIs is a completely made-up story designed to discredit this important herb. That's a little segue, but if you want to know further on that topic, I have done a grumpy old herbalist on that topic. So look at that big impact from St. John's wort on BDNF. And the final of my 4 key herbs is ginkgo. So there's a very interesting trial that was done in tardive dyskinesia. Now, what happens if a person with schizophrenia is given the antipsychotic drugs? They can get this movement side effect from those drugs called tardive dyskinesia. And there's actually quite high level evidence that ginkgo biloba can counter the impact of these drugs in causing tardive dyskinesia in this schizophrenic patient cohort. But this paper proposed quite an interesting mechanism as to how the ginkgo biloba might be helping with this tardive dyskinesia. The authors suggested from their study that the BDNF system may be implicated in the pathophysiology of tardive dyskinesia and its improvement by ginkgo treatment. What's more, patients with the genetic potential for greater BDNF release seem to obtain the greater reduction in tardive dyskinesia from the ginkgo treatment. So if we look at the specific results, we see the AIMS is the abnormal movement, so it's a measure of the tardive dyskinesia, and you see it started at 7 at baseline, and by week 12 was 4.9 for the ginkgo group, unchanged for the placebo group. And if we look at the BDNF levels, you see they didn't go up hugely dramatically, but they did go up significantly, statistically, in the ginkgo group versus a smaller non-significant increase in the placebo group. So what dose of ginkgo was used? It was 240 milligrams a day of the extract. That's about equivalent of 12 grams of leaf. And there's been a recent study of ginkgo and its impact on BDNF in conjunction with exercise in physically active men. And the author said, our results show that 6 weeks of supplementation with ginkgo provided some marginal improvements in their endurance and blood antioxidant capacity, but also elicited a somewhat better neuroprotection through an increase in the exercise-induced production of BDNF. So a synergy between the ginkgo and the exercise. And the dose used in that study was 160 milligrams a day of extract, equivalent to about 8 grams of leaf. And finally, there have been a few other studies, and I've selected some of the most significant clinical ones here for you. So this was for a proprietary whole coffee cherry extract. So not any coffee bean, coffee cherry extract, from the coffee plant will do it. Just this proprietary one. They found other types didn't. So it's a bit of a mystery as to what's special about that one versus the others. So just keep that in mind. Now, this second study, I'm not that convinced about because it was, as you see, very, very small doses of chamomile and saffron were used, but they did find improved overall health and BDNF while reducing CRP and tryptophan levels in the plasma, and that would thereby increase the availability of tryptophan to the brain. So maybe chamomile and saffron could be reinvestigated at more clinically significant doses, which are at least 10 to 20 times those. And then this final one was at a decent dose, and I think is very, very interesting because we know rosemary is a key NRF2 activating or herb or priming herb. And 22 healthy volunteers consumed rosemary tea, they call it, 5 gram and 100 mil. So not, yeah, so at the strength of an infusion, that's 30 grams per 600 mil. So at an infusion strength, so it's basically an infusion, although the study says tea. And they drank just that much once a day for 10 days. And by day 10, BDNF was nearly doubled. So I'm pretty sure, although I'd like to see a few more studies, or at least one other study done, we can add a rosemary to that list of 4 herbs at that decent dose of 5 grams a day. So happy tippling with your rosemary tea and your ginkgo extract, because we all need to get those neuroplastic effects of the BDNF.